Thank you, Tufail. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. My great thanks to Islamic Renaissance Front, the IRF, for inviting me once again. It's always great to be in Malaysia, to be amongst friends. Dr. Ebrahim Moosa and his colleagues have been extremely generous and warm in inviting me here today. So, the reason I wrote this book, What is a Madrasa, is that you know, I'm a student from that background. And to give you a brief history, many years ago, at age 16, 17, I came into contact with some you know, fellow students at the school that challenged my views on Islam. And I then decided that what I'm going to do is that I want to go and study Islam. And I want to study Islam at the feet of authentic teachers. And then someone suggested to me that, you know, you should go and study at the University of Durban-Westville, which was a university in South Africa where I'm from. I said, are you out of your mind? I can never study Islam at the university. I must study Islam at the feet of authentic scholars who have beards and wear the long jalabiyah, and they have that level of authenticity. And I was scandalized by the suggestion. And it is actually quite amazing that as much as I value my madrasa education, today I am myself a professor at several universities. I was at University of Cape Town, then Stanford, then Duke, and now University of Notre Dame, where I've been there for the last 4 years. So this story, that what is a madrasa, actually was, you know, something I wanted to write a long time ago, but the September 11 and the whole attack on the madrasas by the Western media, affiliating the Taliban to the madrasa, even though the Taliban, some of the Taliban do come out of the madrasas, but all the madrasas are not the same. There are different kinds of madrasas. There are madrasas that are, you know, militant but not violent. There are madrasas that are violent and associated with jihadi movements, but those are very small amount and only in Pakistan. And maybe, yeah, I mean, I can't even talk about if there's any in Bangladesh, but in Pakistan definitely. But the majority of the madrasas in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh are traditional, very traditional orthodox schools. It's a very different kind of Islamic training, but it's not affiliated to violence and jihad and so on. Now, people at those madrasas are also upset about global events, of course. Global events of the, you know, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the attack on Iraq and the developments. So people have opinions and people are very angry at those various places, but that doesn't mean they're not the madrasa people are not the only people that are angry at the US and US power. People from other walks of Muslim life also angry about that. But so 9/11 was one of the motivations, but also the other motivation was in part to also explain to many people outside the madrasas what the madrasas really do. And oftentimes I think people only think of the madrasas because of the weird ulama that they find from time to time. Sometimes you have an alim who says something really unusual, something really weird, and people say, oh my gosh, all of the ulama tradition is bad, it's terrible, let's get rid of it. I remember, I won't mention a name, a very prominent public intellectual invited me to give a lecture, then my book was sold there, and then he took me for dinner. And this is around about 2015, and he told me over dinner that, you know, all these madrasas should be shut down. They should all be shut down. And his idea was that a horse, when it breaks its leg, it should be shot. So the madrasas were seen as that. So I told him, but this is a very extreme view that you have. I'm sure that some people, not all people, but some people in the madrasas also want to shut down secular universities that they think are the sources of great evil and immorality. So this is a kind of a zero-sum game you're talking about. But secondly, madrasas in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, but I'm sure also in parts of Malaysia and Indonesia and in the Malay world, the equivalent of South Asian madrasas, cater for a low-income demographic also. It's the way in which the poor get access to religion. It's the religious literacy of the poor. And also the rich, when their mothers die or when someone has to get married, they don't invite the progressive alim to come do the ceremony. They get the guy with the longest beard and with the biggest turban. So that shows that even those people who claim to be modern educated are still in very much enamored and very much in thrall of certain kinds of Islamic orthodoxy. So this is the kind of background to the book that I wanted to speak to Muslims also. Partly one audience is a Western audience who think of the madrasa as a dangerous place. But the other audience are also Muslims who don't understand what traditional Islamic education is about. And thirdly, also for many people in the madrasas, because there are many things I learned after I left the madrasas, of how I think this tradition can be very valuable if it is used and deployed more effectively. And if some of the things that ought to be taught is really taught in the madrasas, there could be a change in the conversation about Islamic education and Islamic literacy, and we can move forward in advancing Islamic literacy. And lastly, the fourth point that I hope to speak about is that I think that the value of the madrasas, if the madrasas are properly channeled, if they are really enhanced with with the supplements that I will suggest in a few minutes, is that they could become those resources to develop a robust intellectual, moral and spiritual tradition. Not in the form that it is now, but in some kind of transformed way. Because what we have right now is extremely dangerous Islamic literacy. Currently Islamic literacy is dangerous because anybody who is angry can find an angry verse in the Quran or find an angry hadith and inflict horrendous damage on others, but also on Islam and Muslims. And very well-meaning people, well-meaning Muslims who want access to Islamic learning get very thin amounts of Islamic learning, not complex Islamic learning, because there is no intellectual tradition left. The real guardians of the intellectual tradition, who were the ulama, are no longer the guardians of the tradition. They have reduced it to a few slogans and a few teachings and so on. So that's the difficulty. So in terms of the Western audience, I basically in this book try to communicate to audiences to talk about the importance of the role the ulama play and the madrasas play in modern Islamic history. So this book is not about the early madrasas that started in the 11th century and even before that in Egypt and Tunisia and other places where you had mosque madrasas, that the mosques doubled up as madrasas, as teaching places, like the Qarawiyin in Fez or the Al-Azhar under the Fatimids, and not the madrasas in the 11th century, Persia and Iraq and that part of the world where people like Ghazali and Juwaini and other people were trained and were training there. Not that kind of, I'm not talking about those madrasas. I'm talking particularly about madrasas in India that happened that emerge in the 18th century and in the late part of the 19th century, and they developed franchises throughout India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and globally into a whole new different kind of madrasa system. And I tried to, for the one audience, I tried to explain to that audience that these institutions are actually very valuable institutions because they are the institutions that educate Muslims in piety practices, in the ibadat. If anything they do that, and they also provide teachings on how to deal with day-to-day Islamic practices, from Islamic banking to organ transplantation to practices regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, and so on. And they are the people that advise there. Now, obviously, many people who might be in this audience here or hearing me abroad, wherever they are, I don't mean to say that I endorse everything that they do in the way they teach the Islamic law, marriage and divorce, but they are doing a practical service. There's no doubt about that. They deliver back. They are the imams of the mosque. They're the muftis. They're doing all this kind of stuff in different parts of the world. And their audiences are not a few thousand. Their audiences amount into tens of millions. Tens of millions they have access to. So even if people do not go and pray at mosques, even if they don't pray 5 times a day, even if they're only Eid Muslims, they go to mosque every Eid, even they follow those teachers, the authority that comes out of the mosque. So we must be careful not to, continuously diss the ulama, because we don't have real alternatives. And we need to be careful how we talk about that, because that might be the resource that will also lead to better possibilities. For the Muslim audience, I try to say in this book that you need to understand that, most people think that, if they pick up a book by Sayyid Qutb or they pick up a book by Maududi, that's the beginning and the end of Islam. Or if they can read, 2 pages of English translation, okay, they got it. We're good to go. That is one kind of interpretation of Islam, but Islamic interpretation had a diverse, a contradictory, a complex historical tradition. And Muslims had different views on the same thing. And it was good like that in the past. It gave rise to diversity, complexity, beauty in intellectual in knowledge. That was the great possibility that was in the past. And people who could make a great contribution to knowledge and civilization. You think about Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, think about Al-Ma'arri, think about the famous people that you already know, like Ibn Sina al-Farabi, but also Ibn Rushd, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Khaldun, people in different parts of the world. Here in this part of the world, you had Al-Raniri, and you had, different kinds of scholars in Sub-Saharan Africa, the great libraries of Timbuktu in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in North Africa, you had great people like, someone like a man by the name of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was a revolutionary fighter against colonialism, and was defeated. And I always like to tell the story of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who was a traditional scholar who was an alim, but he was also a Sufi, and he felt it necessary they had to combat his country's occupation by the French, so he started a jihad against occupation. He was defeated in his jihad. And when he was defeated in his jihad, he was put into bondage, and when he was asked, he said, I wanted to do something, but God wanted something else. Now you need to understand this man saying that I wanted something, God wanted something else. He realized there's a higher power that he doesn't have to always win. He didn't say that, every one of you who are hearing me now, each one of you must become a suicide bomber overnight. He didn't say that. His understanding was much more humane. It was a humanistic understanding underneath that, his declaration of Islam. But even better lessons come out of this man's life. He makes an agreement with the French that he will be put into exile in Damascus. Instead, the French take him for several years to France with his children and with his family, and really he lives under very bad conditions. Finally, he ends up in Damascus. In Damascus, that was under French rule in that period, there was an uprising against the French. Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi instructs his children to go and guard a neighborhood that was predominantly French. And he said none of the protesters and none of the people of the malcontents who want to kill or destroy the homes of of the French. He said, none of them are going to do that. They're not going to do that. People say, you're out of your mind. These people occupied your country. They defeated you. They didn't agree to their agreement. They didn't adhere to the agreement. Now you want to defend French people? He gave this amazing answer. He said, since when are they our masters in morality? Since when are they our teachers in morality? So there you have a person who suffered, who stood for what he thought was the truth, suffered, defeated, but still could sustain a humane understanding of morality, that you do not harm people. That is the tradition that the madrasas ought to have and do have, if it is studied properly, about the authors, the people that write the books that people study today. And that is tradition that the majority of Muslims are obscured from and are ignorant of. Not by willfulness, but by changes in educational systems, that they no longer have access to those resources in the tradition of real humanity. Because that is the tradition that made an Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. That is the tradition that made other individuals and so on. I write in the book about a story of Mahmud al-Hassan. Mahmud Hassan is the great anti-colonial fighter of the Deoband school. So in the book I talk about 3 franchises of madrasas: the Deoband school, the Barelvi school, and I talk a little bit about the Ahlul Hadith school, but I mainly focus on the Barelvi and the Deobandi and the Barelvi, because I spent time and studying at Deoband, and I graduated from Nadwatul Ulama, so I know those schools better. So Mahmud Hassan is one of the first graduates of the Deoband school. The Deoband school was opened its doors in 1867, and he's one of the first graduates there. And he then becomes a very strong anti-colonial activist against the British, close friends to Gandhi and other people. But he's older, of course. He dies earlier his great student once says that they were talking about a hadith in the hadith class. The student's name is Manazir Ahsan Gilani. And so Gilani talks about the lesson where they talk about this teaching in which, you are told that you have to love the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam more than you love your mother and your father and your family and your wealth and your children and your wife. And somehow it came up in the conversation about, those people who insult the Prophet. And people then go out into protest against the Prophet. And he then says, that this is the teacher then says, those people who go and protest against whatever offense was made against the Prophet, he says, one must check whether these people are really sincere. And I'm trying to find the text there. And whether they're really sincere in what they're doing, let me see if I can find it quickly. Yes. So this is from page 69 of the book. And so one of Mahmud Hassan's students, Manazir Ahsan Gilani, who died in 1956, recalls his teacher's view during a class discussion on the commandment requiring Muslims to show undivided love and devotion to the Prophet Muhammad. None of you truly believe, the Prophet Muhammad declared, until I am more beloved to him than his kin, his wealth, and when I am more preferred to all other persons in love. End of quote. Muslims had so fully internalized this commandment, Gilani told his teacher, Mahmud Hassan, that even the slightest contempt shown to the person or memory of the Prophet Muhammad would be intolerable. Indignant Muslims, he added, will not hesitate to sacrifice their lives in defense of the honor of the Prophet Muhammad. Mahmud Hassan Gilani explains, treated his students comment as a teaching moment. Mahmud Hassan confirms that Muslims do indeed display their passion in response to blasphemous assaults on the honor of the Prophet. Yet, ironically, Mahmud Hassan questions whether Gilani had accurately diagnosed the motives behind such protests. And therefore, I intentionally included this section because there are so many actions that Muslims are doing in the name of fighting against blasphemy that I thought that this lesson that follows what I read in a moment should be a lesson that we should be hearing from someone who is extremely orthodox, but who comes from a very different understanding of tradition than this angry and diminished tradition that people claim to have today. Love, Mahmud Hassan explains, requires that one sacrifice everything in order to please the beloved. Then with biting wit he asks, did the religious conduct of the ordinary protesting Muslims really please the Prophet? Did they want to protest in defense of the Prophet? But is their general conduct really something that pleases the Prophet? In other words, he's asking the question, you for 99 days or for 350 odd days of the year, you hurt the Prophet with your bad conduct. Then on the one day you want to go and protest and you think you did a good thing. Right? So that's what he says. He says, does the indignation Muslims display, he asks, truly symbolize their love for the Prophet? Think about it, Mahmud Hassan then astutely remarks, and now this is his own words. Contempt shown the Prophet, on whom be peace, unconsciously hides our own experience of that attempted scorn. Actually, it is the collective ego and self-esteem of Muslims that feel wounded. It's a self-esteem, is our ego that is wounded, not so much that of the Prophet. And then he says, yet, this is all Mahmud Hassan's words, yet whom we regard as Prophet and Messenger is not someone you can possibly humiliate. You cannot humiliate him. It is the collective ego, the we, that experiences the lash of contempt. To claim that love for the Prophet, on whom be peace, drives the desire to avenge such an offense is to only further a serious misunderstanding, he says. Self-delusion. Self-delusion is possibly the best description. Whoever contemplates this matter calmly will surely recognize their inconsistent conduct and will reach a similar conclusion to mine, Mahmud Hassan says. Yet people will go on claiming that their actions please their beloved irrespective of the consequences. In the meanwhile, the daily calls to prayers go unanswered, while the multitude indulge in futile and useless conversation and thus fail to hasten to the muazzin's invitation to pray. In all fairness, how appropriate is the proclamation of love for the Prophet made by the mouths of such people? End of quote. Now, such a counterintuitive explanation from a pioneer of the Deoband school exhibits intellectual confidence, sophistication, and maturity of a traditionalist interpretation. So it is not those people, who just talk about tradition, we are traditional, and so on, that is real. It is the content of traditionalism, that of a tradition, that is important. So part of this book is also to try and make Muslims familiar with some of the gems in this tradition and how we can possibly reconstitute that. And also, thirdly, to in some ways inform Muslims who are not connected to the madrasa tradition to begin to see the value of an intellectual tradition. Where I talk about some of the great authors, small biographies. I've written it in an accessible way so people can read it. It's not difficult to read. And small biographies of the key players. And how when I was studying this between age 18 and 23 or 24, for the 6 years I spent in the madrasas of India, how I got only part of the message and understanding of what this tradition was. In fact, I was fairly disillusioned when I finished. I said, I studied all these things, but I don't get the big picture. In fact, I was much more interested in political Islam after I finished the madrasa, because that was the Islam that was really working in the world, the Iranian Revolution, Islamic State, and all this kind of stuff. And then I go to London to work as a journalist, and I get this book into my hand called Islam by Fazlur Rahman. And that book I begin to read, and I said, oh my God, this man knows everything I've studied, even more. And he puts us all together in a very understandable way. Then my faith in this intellectual tradition was restored. And then as I started working as an activist, political activist, community activist in South Africa, then afterwards I went to university to do my master's and PhD, this madrasa tradition became much more significant to me as I began to restudy it and understand its full meanings, and went back to its what's name. And then I realized that the madrasa did not give me everything that it purported to give me in terms of the materials, but there are different ways to read the madrasa tradition. And therefore I say in the book that if I were to be asked again, and I was 17 or 18, that if I want to go and study Islam at the university or at the madrasa, I will possibly make the choice that I will go to a madrasa. It was a very difficult life. As you mentioned, you couldn't stand at age 5 or 6, the difficult life. Imagine going at age 17 from a country like South Africa and a place like India, which was very challenging. These are very, very, low budget schools. Life conditions and living conditions are challenging, but I was determined to finish it and so on. And thank God I did, and because it gave me the confidence to understand the tradition. Nowhere can they teach you Arabic with this efficiency in a modern university as in a madrasa. I had access to Urdu, some Persian, a huge literature in Urdu now became available to me. The experiences of millions of people in South Asia. Okay, so, and then access to Urdu poetry and Urdu literature just makes the world a powerful world, a much more powerful world, to understand that Muslims in India and what is today now India, Pakistan and Bangladesh had a rich history. And that rich history is a history of Islam. And oftentimes we don't want to read poetry because, oh, poetry is bad. No, poetry is part of who you are. Literature is part of who you are. Literature is the experience of people who claim to be Muslims and who are part of a Muslim practice. Literature is the experiences. Those experiences should not be denied. To the contrary, those experiences should be valued. Unfortunately, the madrasas had made such a strict segregation between what they teach and the experiences of contemporary Muslims, and they don't bring about a reconciliation with the experiences of contemporary Muslims and the tradition, that this tradition has gone into a frozen mode. The tradition is frozen and life continues, and so we have this frozen tradition. Occasionally, a frozen package is thrown onto the table, and it's still frozen because you can't work with it. So it gives you a fairly odd understanding of what it is that they're trying to answer. But if a tradition is living, it does something else. And so the fourth point I wanted to make, and that is this question, is that the goal of this book was to make sure, and maybe in a follow-up essay I would do so, or in the next edition I will add something to it, is that how does one go about in understanding and constructing or rehabilitating a intellectual tradition? What I say in this book is that for a good part of the 18th century, when this curriculum in India was designed by a man called Mullah Nizamuddin, and therefore is known as the Nizami curriculum, it was very much logic and philosophy heavy. And the idea was to create a student who can think, a thinking individual. The downside was that they taught, the logic and philosophy they taught was Aristotelian and Neoplatonic. And then by the 18th century the world was already changing, and the new rulers from Europe who were ruling India came with new philosophies and the ideas that created universities that teaches engineering and that teaches modern medicine and teaches all other stuff. And so these folks in the madrasas are still studying Aristotle. Whereas Aristotle's sell-by date is over. And so that's one thing. But they did have this rational approach to understanding. But what most of us fail to understand is that they had a big framework of rationality, and that framework sets the boundary of how to understand Islam. The framework was everything. The framework was rational. It was also based on, but it was based on a certain kind, what we call, an idea of what is out there in the world. What is out there in the world. What we call, by a fancy philosophical word, we call it the ontology. What is there? What is being? Unfortunately, this school of thought, known as the Farangi Mahal school of thought, brought the inherited framework that Muslims had inherited to the table. But as the madrasas in India, pre-colonial, pre-partition India, as these madrasas developed, they gradually abandoned the philosophy and logic components of it. And the curriculum became much more hadith and centered, and hadith and fiqh centered. So it's the hadithi fiqhi movement that was historically the kind of main thing, became now the dominant one in the madrasas, hadith and fiqh. So now the framework that used to be that is still there, but that big framework is no longer robust. That framework now is being overrun by a hadithi fiqhi framework that is much more smaller. It looks at the world in a much more smaller prism. Whereas the other one, the philosophically inspired and logic inspired, was a bigger framework. Was about real life and its experiences. But this was the flavor of a 20th century Islam, 19th and 20th century Islam, that now became that Muslims wanted to have much more, Islamically identifiable symbols in the hand. They wanted hadith and Quran, they want to speak straight from there. But now the framework now becomes the Quran and hadith. And what about Muslim experience? What are you talking about? Muslim experience is no longer there, part of that thing. So that old tradition was the tradition that embodied Muslim historical experience. Unfortunately, the tradition, that big tradition that they gave us, was not updated for several centuries. It was just used as a framework that earned and enjoyed a certain amount of credibility within Muslim community. But it was not relevant to the emerging 18th and 19th century world. That was a shifting world. That is a post-Newtonian world. That is a world that is now, in science of moving away from mechanism and now beginning to think about the world in a very different way. It's the emergence of the steam engine. It's the emergence of Louis Pasteur and other kinds of scientific developments. That is not something that happens in the laboratories, but it changes your world. You have the locomotive now. You have train engines. You have steam engines. You have now new forms of and ways of governance, right, and so on. So all these things changes. So what I'm trying to say is that this book is also a plea to invite people to begin participating in reviving a robust intellectual tradition and no longer look at Islam through a very narrow prism. But Islam is something that has always been part of a Muslim experience. And what has happened is that we've thrown off Muslim experience and we've just held on to two sources. So we have two sources without the memory of a Muslim experience. Because the past Muslims' experiences are not our experiences. But we need to have those experiences in order to make sense that yes, we are doing exactly what they are doing. They heard the Quran, they heard the Prophet through their experiences. And that experience had a dynamic relationship with the sources and the teachings. Okay? Dynamic. What has happened now is that we are now holding on to two sources and we say everything that Muslims are doing is wrong. So the biggest word in our current practice is the W word, wrong, wrong, wrong. Everything is wrong. Okay? Or haram, haram, haram. Okay? As someone prompted me here. So we need to spend. Therefore someone said, it was a guy called Yaroslav Pelikan who said, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. In other words, the dead still, they are with us in terms of they've passed on the living faith to us. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, of the living. Traditionalism is when you have dead faith of the living people. That's a contradiction. Living people should have a living faith. And that is when you become traditionalist and not a person of tradition. A person of tradition knows that tradition is vitalistic. Tradition is living. Tradition always has to have oxygen. And tradition only breathes when it is in touch with the realities of the day. Now, unfortunately, as much as I'm a friendly critic of the madrasas, this is the memo that the madrasa communities have not received. That how to keep a tradition alive is that you must bring in today's oxygen. You can't bring me the oxygen of Ghazali of 500 years ago. That is old oxygen. Or Ibn Sina. You must have, someone will possibly contradict me that oxygen can't last for that long. Oxygen is always fresh. Exactly my point is that oxygen, is something. And oxygen is what really gives us life. And that is the world in which we are living. And that's we have to be in touch with our tradition. But so that the tradition always responds in ways that are authentic and ways that are relevant to our needs. See, what are young Muslims looking for? Why do people gravitate towards people who wear funny clothes and speak, a lot of subhanallahs and alhamdulillaahs and those kind of stuff and make people feel good about themselves? They're looking, it's a genuine search. They're looking for authenticity. They want to be authentic. And, many people can take them for a ride on authenticity. Give them old stuff in an old thing, but what do young people know? They don't know better. We don't have high levels of literacy in Muslim societies that people can really access high-grade literacy. Everything is dumbed down. So on the internet, on Facebook and so on, you have to give it in 2 lines. People fall asleep if you talk, or if you tell them, do a little bit more or read a little bit more. People want it quick. They want it in 120 word characters. They want Islam in 120 word characters in the tweet. They want a Twitter version of Islam. So that is the kind of laziness that has come into it. And people also don't want to think. Because thinking means you're going to take risks. Thinking means that you are going to take responsibility. It's good to outsource the responsibility to some imam or some sheikh. And then you feel okay about yourself. Or you say, I follow the sheikh, my sheikh spoke to me today, send me a tweet message, the sheikh did that, sheikh did that. Yeah, and it's good for the sheikh. I'm not sure it's good for you. It's really good for the sheikh. He's got, 2 million followers. I'm wondering if it's good for you. And so I'm not saying everybody is a charlatan. There are many, many good people out doing good work, and we have to value the people who are giving service. So in some ways, this book is also a plea for not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are a lot of things that the ulama are not getting right. But the time is quickly running out before we can rescue this tradition. Because what is happening is today, Muslims, educated Muslims and not so educated Muslims, especially educated Muslims, want a high octane, simple, and a version of Islam, a high octane, make them feel good version of Islam, and that can be as simple as it is, and they don't have time or they don't have the patience to learn and develop a complex literacy. So they want, tell me how to do it. Do it yourself. But do it yourself means that we need good teachers. We need good educators in Islam. That's what we lack. Our universities are not delivering that. The mosques are not delivering that. The Sunday schools are not delivering that. So it's a general crisis in Islamic education and to talk openly about the need that you can't just draw everything, just quote a verse and think you got the answer. You must have years and years of research behind a verse of the Quran or the Hadith to understand what does this verse or this Hadith mean in the world. It requires a framing. And without the framing, these teachings become, both not used in the way they ought to be used, but also do not deliver the messages in the way that Mahmud Hassan could speak and understand the tradition in his time and say nonsense with this kind of things that people just want to go and do damage to property and claim that they love the Prophet, whereas in fact they don't really honor the Prophet in the other teachings the Prophet do. Or get someone like Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who has the courage to stand up and say, I will even protect those who harm me. And that is my morality. And that can only come out of a teaching that takes a tradition seriously. Because a person of tradition has a certain kind of confidence that he or she is not bullied by simpletons and by literalists and by people who use all kinds of slogans, but can stand up to the sloganeering and can stand up and talk sense in a world that needs sense much more today than before. And especially in the Muslim world, we need much more sensible Islamic talk than the insensible literacy we have right now. We need a sensible literacy that is thick, authoritative, authentic, but also meaningful and gives meaning to people's lives. And not certain slogans of power to silence others, to bully others and so on. That is not what is going to take us forward. These are my initial remarks. Thank you very much for your time.